Welcome, wandering souls and lost sailors, to the Ship of the Dead podcast.
Welcome aboard, mateys, to the Ship of the Dead podcast. We're back with, I think you're the second returning guest I've had, Andrew.
Oh, great.
With none other than the Andrew Kolb. And listeners of the program know you probably most from Neverland because of its tie-in to all things piratey.
Yep, fair.
But last time we discussed Neverland, we discussed your Oz setting book. Mm-hmm. But today we're going to talk about a bunch of things probably, but specifically Wonderland. The RPG setting coming out. What's the release date?
I think November 12th, 2024, depending on when folks are listening to this. So
yeah, I think this will be out just before. So go grab it. What's the best place to pre-order it?
Oh, it's do you know what? It doesn't really matter. I think the thing I always say is, I mean, obviously local is always great, but if you kind of have to save a bit of money and shop online, then leaving a review does as much as like picking a specific store. So
great.
That's something to keep in mind.
Well, welcome to the show, Andrew. Good to have you back.
Great. Thank you for having me.
I have seen a preview of this book. You've done it again, my man.
I was going to say, like, what do you think? What's the initial reaction?
I mean, okay, so the first thing I really wanted to dive into was I was very surprised to see full color art.
Oh.
I was not expecting that. I think it works really well with the book, but given the like very tight color palette of the first two, to see the like kind of, it's like almost like this like photo bashed public domain style. I'm not sure if it actually is that.
Yeah. But, it's,
let's start there. Tell me a little bit about that design decision.
Sure.
And what, like, you know,
I appreciate that. That's a cool way to start. So I think with the first two books, I really tried to explore as much as I can, like within the limits of myself as an illustrator, like different approaches. Like the first one very much inspired by like mid-century picture books. And then the second one being more inspired by kind of like turn of the century jazz era, like posters. So with this and with the kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say whimsical, but gonzo kind of vibe of Wonderland, felt that kind of like collage and was really inspired by like Terry Gilliam's work for Monty Python.
I was going to say, if you're listening and you have not seen any of this book, if you just thought Monty Python, that's the closest that I could think of.
That's the dream. Like that's my ideal. So with the kind of like tone setting imagery, I went with like public domain work and then added some of my own illustrations in much like Terry Gilliam did, where it came like, you know, clouds and some stuff was hand drawn, but there's also lots of like old men in suits and uptight women and stuff like that. So it's a fun mix. It was like a fun way to kind of like stretch my wings and try something else with the art. Because I always love collage and I always love the storytelling of like finding these other elements and putting them in kind of like disparate or incongruent situations. So that was the idea behind the artwork, like the cast illustrations and I guess we can get into maps too, but that stuff is still kind of the same as what you would see in Oz and Neverland. But as far as the kind of like the tone setting artwork, that was all very collage.
Yeah, it's not a total departure, and it's only in like the intro section is that way. And then what's the name of the pandemonium?
Section
is that way.
Yeah. Depending on how deep we want to get into spoilers, but so 2 chapters, definitely. I guess also in like in the back where there are tables and that there are a couple of collages back there too. Yeah.
How about this? We'll take a nod from the Between Two Karens guys, and let's try to keep the first half of the episode spoiler free. We'll talk about design and overall, and then we can get into the deep dive, as they say. You know,
I don't know if I even answered your question. So why the collage? It just like fit. It just like, I think those little interstitials in any Monty Python film or show had the spirit of the tone I was going for with Wonderland. So for anyone who's seen any of that, hopefully will see this artwork and then kind of keep that in the back of their mind as they're reading through the book and setting up their table. Obviously, Wonderland can be whatever you want it to be, as lots of interpretations have taken it. But to get the tone of what I was going for, I think those early kind of like stage setting images do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Sure. You've done such a good job on this. A few months ago, I think I was somewhere working on an adventure for myself, and I was using a deck of cards as a generator.
Oh, cool.
And I was thinking, I think I was like walking around somewhere and I was like, you know what? I should tell Andrew he should totally do that. And I was like, no, he definitely has done that. There's no way he got through making a Wonderland RPG and didn't use a deck of playing cards as a generator. Yeah. And boy, was I right, man. You've got to replace the D12, D20 tables that you see in like Neverland and Oz with like card draws, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and how it gets used?
Yeah. And I also want to be clear that you can still use strictly dice on all of the kind of like random encounter tables.
I mean, you can.
I know. But you should have, like, ideally, you're playing in person. So I will also take a step back and say, I really wanted Wonderland to have a really kind of good at the table vibe. I think because there are so many tactile components to it. So like using, we can get into that too, but like using a chessboard for movement and using a deck of cards for like random encounters just like feels very Wonderlandian. So early on in the development, I think I knew I wanted to use those kind of two core components, like a chessboard and a deck of cards, just based on the books. And was trying to figure out how to do it, and then figuring out the math of it too, and also appreciating my players they're not card counters, but they definitely look for patterns, right? As anyone in an adventure is going to do. So trying to also keep it in a way that, you know, if you flip a heart, you don't always get like a member of the kind of like heart or the Queen of Heart family, right? So still keeping them on their toes, but still having some sort of inherent logic to it. So that was the thinking. Yeah,
I think it's really well implemented. I mean, let's talk about the chessboard thing too, because, well, I think maybe we need to zoom out a bit.
Sure.
Like, I'm just so excited to talk about the deep dive things here, but overall, give us like the overall pitch. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that you've gone a different direction as far as the overall theme, because this is very much a dungeon crawl book. Can you give us like the overall elevator pitch for someone who maybe is not familiar with any of your books? What is Wonderland?
As
an RPG
okay,
book,
great.
You know?
I think Wonderland, and I think this applies to all three books, my kind of guiding light was make a setting that someone who wanted to put their players into this kind of like familiar world from other public domain locations could either take elements or the whole thing and put their players in it, and it'd feel like you're playing in that world. Like, I think a lot of other settings do a great job of taking that as inspiration and then moving 2, 3, 4 steps away from it. And I love that creativity. But what I want is for my players to feel like they're playing in that world. And sure, some things have changed or are a little different than maybe what the books recount, but it still feels very much like you're interacting with Dorothy, or you're interacting with Peter Pan, or you're interacting with the Queen of Hearts, for example. So is this a good elevator pitch? Maybe let me take a step back. I think essentially these books are hopefully, like, if you want to play an adventure or a campaign in one of these public domain settings, then this gives you more than enough to run a session or a year.
A session? Oh, come on.
A one shot.
I feel like these books are more than enough to run for like multiple years if you're a good GM.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, Wonderland, like, it does just such a good job of like, okay, yeah, you have the things that you'd expect, but then there's enough kind of adapted and grafted on to push it into the RPG realm. That I think maybe you wouldn't have expected when you just hear that it's existing, but when you see the book, like the way that you've got the dungeon crawl set up in like chunks using the chessboard. I mean, can you explain that to people who haven't seen a preview of this yet?
Yeah. Okay. So without explaining or kind of giving away too much, then the setting is broken up into blocks. And I think the best way to think of it is like Tetris blocks. So each kind of area of the dungeon kind of fits into kind of like a grid of a certain number of blocks. Some are just like 1 block large, some are 9 blocks, and some are different shapes.
Yeah, but to be clear, you mean like a Tetris block from the top down viewpoint.
Yeah.
Like it might look like this shape, but you're like looking down at a dungeon
map,
right.
So and obviously this is the first time I've really described this outside of in the book. So
yeah, sure.
Let me take a step back. I think what it is and what I want is for a dungeon crawl to be manageable. So in my mind, thinking of different sections as kind of like contained areas that kind of, this is the theme of these 12 rooms or these 3 rooms. And
yeah, they're like regions of if you're thinking old school mega dungeon, they're regions of one level.
Right.
Each block is. Right. Yeah.
But based on the design of them all kind of being in this kind of grid format, they can kind of interlock into different ways that makes it gives you the potential for a GM to rearrange and to make Wonderland your own. Like if you want to take blocks from level 3 and put them up on, or let's say regions from level 3 and put them up into level 1, then they all fit together. If you want to move around or rearrange things after multiple sessions, then you can, which is something that I've done for my play testers. Like every couple of sessions, they'll go to Wonderland and the map is completely different. Some areas stay the same, or some areas within the blocks stay the same. Like the Tea Party's house is always north of the Tea Party like table itself, right? Like those are two areas that are locked together. But if you leave the house or leave that garden, it may take you to a mine, or next time you go through those doors and it might take you to a vegetable garden. Like it has that kind of element of randomness that feels appropriate for Wonderland, without hopefully making it too much for the GM to run. Like I wanted it to feel like, oh, we never know what we're going to expect, but for the GM being like, oh, there's like order to all of this that I can see that makes it easy for me to keep track of things.
Yeah, the blocks are really cool because, like, I mean, you just said this, but you can keep things that need to be next to each other. But then, you know, have that, you could have the tea party connect to the beach if you wanted.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
So I guess to give this like an extrapolated point of view, you have it set up into 3 sections, which is blocks, which is like you said, Tetris pieces.
Yep.
Made of squares.
Right.
So like a Tetris piece could be 4 squares in a, you know, L shape. And then the squares have rooms. And if you're thinking like normal dungeon crawl, you're crawling at the room level, and you could have like 1 or 3 or 10 rooms in one block, right? So it could be like, this is a bedroom, or it could be like, here's a chapel. And then the block could be the entire church, right? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. So I think maybe a good example that I can use is on one of the levels, there's a library. So the library is kind of like that T shape for Tetris. So the top square within that block is the 3rd level of the library. And then that middle section is the 2nd level of the library. And then the bottom square is the 1st level of the library. So even within levels of the dungeon, there's verticality within the blocks. And within those blocks, there's different areas. It hopefully makes sense. And the reason why I broke it down into those different chunks is so that way you can use the chessboard for movement, because the chessboard doesn't really kind of go at the room level. It just goes at the square level. I promise, I don't know how good of a job I am doing to describe it, but I promise reading it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's hopefully it's totally fine.
I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I don't know if we're really nailing it, but it actually it's really simple if you see a picture of it.
Yeah. Right? I really promise, like if you understand Tetris blocks and how they all kind of fit together, that's your anchor. That is what kind of keeps everything organized.
And like, I like the idea too of maybe it's like a bad Tetris game where there are actually like holes in the chessboard, you know?
Yeah.
But another cool thing about it is that, you know, you have it designed, like if for those familiar with Neverland, each page is a hex, right? Well, in this, you have it where each spread is like, usually there are 2 pages for a spread. And on the left will be information about the whole block. And then a right will be like the maps inside that block, but they're like squares in the shape of the block. And like my thought was, dude, you should just buy 2 copies of this book and cut one of them up. And then you can, I know that's sacrilege, but you know, cut one of them up. And then you have like, every time they get to a new block, you can just drop out the battle maps, or not battle maps, the RPG maps, you know?
Yeah. I guess this hasn't gone live yet because it hasn't launched, but on my website, I will, or after release, the individual squares and blocks will be available just to download. So you can kind of like,
so you can print them out.
Yeah.
So you don't have to cut up a book.
Yeah. And also I think because, and to not spoil it, because these blocks interlock and you can kind of make this different kind of puzzle out of it, especially virtually, I wanted you to be able to have the individual blocks so that way you can arrange them in your own configuration. Like I have a number of different configurations in the book. So if you want to recreate those, actually you don't need to, because those maps will also be available. But if you want to make something of your own, like if you want to bring in blocks from levels 2 and 3 up to level 1, all of them will be available. And then you can kind of like fit them all together.
Yeah. And okay, so you're mentioning levels.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of said in your little like designer's commentary at the end, originally you were going to do like 1 level, like a mega dungeon, but then you ended up going with 4 because of the 4 suits of the deck, right? Does that mean that do the 4 levels have their own individual themes that are related to the suits of the deck?
Yeah, I think going into that might go into spoilers, might spoil too much, but yes, I think that was part of it. I will also say, and this is a very, I don't know how to explain it. Like how I justify any decision I make has to have some sort of logic to it. So the first 3 levels have 17 different blocks, and then the 4th level is just 1 block, and we won't explain why. But that then works out to 52 blocks, and that was also then my thinking of like, okay, if I have like a 52 deck, like if I have 52 blocks, that seems maybe not manageable. That's maybe too much, but at least it feels like that's the right number.
No, I think it's perfect. I think because first off, you could always just remove part of the deck.
Sure.
Or since you're using a deck of cards, you can just pick the cards that you want to play with. Like I even did this in adventure I'm working on where I'm like, okay, I'm going to write the one shot version. I'm going to say at the beginning for the one shot, just use the face cards. If you want to run this as a campaign, use the whole deck. And I think a GM could do that if they were trying to generate it randomly or more so randomly. They could totally just pick out the cards that they want, the rooms
absolutely.
that they want, the blocks that they want.
And you can also make, because it's a modular setting or a modular map, you could make the map as big or as little as you want. Like if you want to do a one shot where the grid is only 3x3, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you want to do the chessboard 8x8, which is kind of what everything's designed to, you can. And then also that kind of 3-dimensional chess of there being multiple levels. But if you think my group, or it's too much for me to manage to have that much planned, then just take the blocks you really want to use, fit them together in a way that makes sense, and make it as big as you need it to be. Like my goal with these books has always been, maybe you're somewhat familiar with running an adventure, but I want to make these as easy to run at the table as possible with as minimal prep as possible. Like hopefully everything that you need to get something going is in those spreads or in that spread for each block. I
love that. I'm actually going to read you this thing here. So obviously I mentioned earlier, Neverland has been has had a lot of traction in the pirate board community just because it's, got the tropical island and there are pirates that are undead there. So Erin, who is a friend of mine, who's in my Dark Caribbean playtest group, she is actually in our Harbor Master program, which they run games publicly for credit for swag. And every Thursday at a store 10 minutes from me, she runs Neverland in Fireborg. So I get to go and I get to play in this Neverland setting. It's awesome. But I asked her if she wanted to ask you any questions, and she wrote a little thing she wants me to read to you that tells exactly what you said. She said, I wanted to say, as a new GM, running this module has been an eye-opening experience and an absolute dream. I feel like I could run the material in this book for years and continue finding something new and exciting in Neverland. Everything in this book is easy to understand and to run with on the fly. Thank you for writing these books, and I look forward to running Oz and Wonderland in the future. So
very kind.
Thanks to Erin. I do agree though, there's so many RPG books out there, and some of them are so dense and they're so hard to you have to read a novel to comprehend how you're running it, or you have to read a chapter and hope that something else that you run into doesn't really affect it. And I feel like your books are written with the opposite approach, where you can just open up these kind of dashboard control panel style spreads and run the location with just the encounters. Now you do have to be imaginative, but I think you kind of remove that step of what am I going to prepare today? Well, when you can't prepare because you don't know where they're going to go, they could go out of any exit,
Right.
I really do think that really,
I appreciate that.
works.
I think my background in design really lends itself to this, in that for me, I think it was the combination of being graphic designer or history and graphic design and a new GM and going, I need all this information different. Any adventure I would read, I was I need to basically recreate it in a way that I can use practically. Yeah. I'm sure lots of people have run into that. So
absolutely.
Ideally, then in approaching these books, my goal was what do I personally need at the table, and then figuring that out. So there's lots of, well, not lots, but there's some dense paragraphs of here's a bit of flavor for the block, but essentially here's an area where you can just get a simple overview of this little section. And then over here is some idea generating tables that you can roll on quickly. Hopefully, if you only have 2 minutes, then you'll get something out of it. But if you have 20 minutes to read and prep, then hopefully you get more out of it. And you don't need to wade through one to get to the other. They're kind of two separate experiences just based on what you have time for. At least that's my goal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it does a great job of that, of tying the two methods together. And to be clear, when you say there is some dense text, it's dense for you or for this book, not for
right.
what we're all used to with some of these,
Right. We're talking 2 paragraphs of text and mostly filled with puns. So at the end of the day, I don't know how dense that actually is.
Yeah. I mean, for me, honestly, I know you're familiar with Old School Essentials because you had it in your appendix. Do you have Dolmenwood?
No. So I have it's hard because as now a creator, I walk a fine line of how much of the community can I consume without fear of
you want to have your own voice,
right? Yeah. So I haven't. I kind of like I read reviews and I look at actual plays and stuff like that to kind of get absorbed into it, but I don't actually like have it just for fear of taking too much.
Well, I think that you and Gavin have come from a similar inspiration standpoint. I mean, Dolmenwood is very, very. It's kind of got this like fae vibe, spooky forest, but his preview PDFs, their print PDFs are like out. You can go look at them. And when I look at them, I get like bummed out for my own book because I'm like, dude, there's so much in here and it's so well organized, but it's like a lot of, Gavin is a writer. Right. Obviously he can do great layout, but he is a writer and he hires artists. And I'm on the other end of the spectrum. And every time I'm in that book and getting overwhelmed, I open one of your books to remind myself like, oh, you know what? I didn't need any of that. Like, that's great for that. But like, I just played this last week and with this one little table, we had just as much inspiration, Yeah. And I think that that's a really key thing that you said there, that like giving enough detail to go deep if you need, but just enough to go now. And I especially coming from like a Wizards of the Coast 5e adventure module thing, you don't get that way to the dashboard floor table way to run a location.
Right. And I mean, it's hard because I definitely, as I've now written 3 of these books, I really try to keep in mind that for someone, this might be the first time that they're running a setting. Like they might be hopefully they've probably played before. I assume that they have some experience with TTRPGs, but as far as a GM, I do try to keep a new GM in mind, because I remember when I was like, I have no idea how to, like, I see lots of posts about running dungeon crawls, but I don't actually know what that looks like in practice. And it talks about going to room, but like, what is that logically doing? And to speak to like OSE, then reading through and understanding, oh, okay, like I understand the kind of order of events now. But for a lot of people, or at least for me, I recognize I didn't know how to run a hex crawl. I knew what it was as a concept or a point crawl, but what does that actually look like, and what do I need to practically do it? And then hopefully instilling my books with at least the training wheels, so that way you can find other resources and go, okay, I have this basic skeleton to build off of, and then going from there.
So in your mind, like, has this completed a cycle for you? Like, are you like, you did point crawl, you did hex crawl, you did dungeon crawl. I know you also mentioned like exploration, political, like intrigue, social and combat. Yeah. Like, are you done? Like, do you have another book in mind?
I don't know. I mean, like, I will be transparent, and I've definitely on my kind of like Discord, folks have asked like, what is the next setting? And I think, to be very clear, these were the 3 that I always kind of had in mind, and I'd always kind of mapped those 3 pillars of RPGs onto these settings for my own kind of like sanity.
Yeah.
So I would love to do more books, but I also know that I don't want to just make something just to kind of like keep the shelf stocked.
Yeah, people want, like, they don't want you to just make something to get a product out. They want you to make the thing you want to make, Yeah,
and I think what I want is for it to come organically. Like, not that I'm just going to sit and go, ideas come to me and I'll just wait. But I think the speed or the succession of these first 3 books is kind of because I already had kind of like a road that I was going to walk down. You've been dreaming
of them for so long.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And kind of always knew how they kind of mapped to those pillars, and like, right, Oz is a very social game, and Wonderland, with kind of like it being very frustrating, can lend itself really well to combat. Like it all kind of like always fit. So it kind of flowed very naturally. And going forward, I think I want that same feeling of like, oh yes, this feels right. And it might take 6 months. It might take a couple of years. I'm not sure, and I want to keep looking into it, but
wait for that lightning to strike, though.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And I mean, like, I guess, to use that metaphor, I am walking around holding like long metal rods, but I also am not just trying to.
But you're not like happen. You're not doing lightning or like weather seances in your basement yet. You're not.
No. I feel good about these 3, and I'm excited to kind of get back into it, but also know that if it takes time, then I will go and work on something else, and maybe that will kind of like lock it in for me, or I'll watch a movie and that'll lock it in. So
it's funny because the last time we talked, when we got done recording, I was like, hey, can you tell me what you're working on? And you were like, no, but if you guess, and I had a couple guesses, I still think that you would crush our like King Arthur. I think that would
you.
be, I know that's not the same kind of public domain, but then when we got off the call, I was like, wait, no, what's Wonderland? Oh, I should have, so.
Yeah, it, like I said, it kind of always felt like Neverland was a dream of like, if I can make this into a reality, that's already above and beyond anything I could have ever hoped and imagined for.
Sure.
And that as kind of the kind of mountain to climb. And as I'm climbing that mountain going, and I can see two other mountains in the horizon and going, if I can manage this, then this is what I would want to do.
Have you seen Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story?
I've seen clips of it.
There's this whole running gag where he they get him to start trying different drugs backstage.
Oh, okay.
And at one point he busts in and they're like, what are you guys doing? He's like, uppers and downers. It's the logical next step for you. And that's how I feel with you. It's like,
yeah,
Neverland was you even said at the end, in the little outro author's notes section that you kind of maybe were more excited about this than Oz, but that you needed to do Oz first to learn the skills to get to this.
Oh, I think,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I didn't feel ready to tackle this after Neverland. And,
yeah, that's the way you put it.
And Oz was very much like, this is a series that I have some relationship with, but not as deep as Neverland and Wonderland. And that in itself was very exciting to me because it was like an element of discovery and these niche characters that I didn't have experience with. So what can I do with that? So it was like a very different approach. I think if I would have done Wonderland after Neverland, the process would have felt too similar. And I think that's where I would have maybe repeated. I think it would have felt too repetitive just for me as a creative process. I'm still really happy with Oz as it just feels very different from what I did with Neverland. And
Sure.
This feels very different, but also building off those first two. I don't know. It just feels like the right sequence for me, at least behind the scenes.
Yeah. One thing I really like about this one, both the book, but also just as a concept for a setting, I struggle as a kind of pseudo fantasy history guy. My games are all based off kind of history with fantasy elements that I always struggle with. Everything needs to be really logical. Dungeons need to have a purpose, or they need to have had a purpose at one point, and now you're discovering them. I always have a problem with kind of old school modules where it's just in this room there's this thing, and in that room there's that, and it's I like playing those, but as a designer I really struggle with that. But when I crack this thing open, I'm like, this is the perfect setting to get as gonzo as you want. Literally you can make it totally gonzo, and a thing could be one thing, but when it's spelled a different way or there's a pun related, it turns into something else. Or there are weird, can you talk to me a little bit about what that was like working on a setting that has a license to be as gonzo as you want?
Yeah, again, I think, and that was maybe because of, or a reaction to the previous books, with Neverland being very wilderness based and kind of discovery. To me, the opposite of that creatively was go very urban, very dense population, very inhabited. And I think this was a reaction to that in a different direction, in that there was so much logic and so much kind of these rivers generate the electricity and this is the neighborhood where all that comes from. There's so much of what you're talking about, an inherent logic, that getting to kind of go the opposite direction again, but in a different direction as Neverland with the kind of chaotic or the surreal elements really was a lot of fun. But I will also say, and I guess we could start getting into spoilers. There was also
let's we're gonna lift the spoiler tag, so
sure. Okay,
everybody don't turn it off if you don't.
Yeah, okay. Last thing I will say before we get to spoilers is if you want to run a dungeon setting that feels a little silly and whimsical, I think this is a good book for all ages. And I mean, I think you know what you're getting into with Wonderland as a setting, and I hope it delivers on that promise. So that's it. So now, happy to get into spoilers now if you're ready and if your audience is ready.
Let's do it. I mean, one thing I wanted to touch on, I mean, it's not totally spoilery off the get-go, but we'll maybe get there, is
sure.
Can you explain to our listeners the dungeon crawl versus board crawl versus depth crawl and what those three concepts are and how you implemented them?
Yeah. So I will not take credit for the depth crawl.
I was going to say, is that a Gardens of Yin thing?
Yes. Yeah. And I think they also have this, I don't know how to say the word. I'm going to say Stygian library.
Yeah. Stygian library. Right? Yeah. That's what I would say, Stygian. Yeah.
So A depth crawl. No, let me go the other direction first. So a dungeon crawl is like kind of really harkens back to kind of old school gaming where your players are going like room by room as either a collective. They might split off, but essentially, okay, we're at the door. We listen at the door. We open the door. We go through
down
into
the
next
door.
room.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And
the entire
really,
premise for what's that card game? Munchkin. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
We kick down the door. Yeah.
Like the idea of the 10-foot pole, like all of that comes from dungeon crawls where you
I check for traps.
Yes, it's such a rhythm. And why it's such a good format is there is such a rhythm, and doors do a really good job of like separating encounters. So it's not like, oh, what do I see on the horizon? It's like, well, what you see is a wall and a door. Like it really limits. So it's a really great kind of format and why the hobby really leans towards that. One level up though, for me is what I've called a board crawl, which can kind of act as like an abstraction of a clump of rooms. So I think maybe a good example to consider is like a chase scene. Is I don't want the movement in a chase scene to be, okay, you get to this door and then you throw it open and then you hop over this table. It has to span a bit more or get slightly more abstract. So when we're talking about the elements in these different areas in Wonderland, there's the rooms, but then at a higher level, there are those squares, and a board crawl works at the square level. So you might be running through these 3 rooms in a person's house. But then once you get through those rooms, then you get into a field. And then once you get through the field, then you're in a cave. And going at that higher level and working at the board crawl lets you traverse space quicker. I think that's essentially my goal, was be able to abstract moving great distances at speed. And then also if you, especially getting into a dungeon crawl and going into rooms frequently or going and backtracking, then you can kind of skip over some stuff because you're moving at a board crawl level as opposed to.
So you're saying like you dungeon crawled in, you could board crawl
Yes.
out.
Yeah. Well put. Yeah. And then when you're rolling encounters, then you can say, oh, okay, you got halfway back and now you're in this area. And then you kind of zoom back into the dungeon crawl to be able to resolve that encounter. It's kind of like fast travel, but not at the kind of like, to think video game terms, like not quite at the world level. It's just like one level up. If you think the old Final Fantasies where you like go into a town, then you leave the town and then you're kind of like walking around the world until you get into another town. So that's kind of the board crawl. And then the depth crawl I really use to explore abstract spaces or areas like a forest or a cave where like there's not rooms in the same way. Like when you're walking through a forest, sure, there are areas, but you're not describing every tree. So I try to use more landmarks to say, okay, you've walked for 15 minutes into this forest and now you find this area. You could walk 15 minutes in the forest again and find the same area, or you could find something else. And procedurally how that works is rolling dice. And as you go deeper and deeper, you roll more dice. So the numbers organically get higher and higher, which then goes and corresponds with a list of landmarks. So
yeah, it's kind of like a point crawl without the points, right?
Yeah. And depth crawl really is perfect because it's kind of like, you know, hold your breath and dive down into the water, but how far or how deep into it are you going to go before you kind of head back? Yeah. Things get more dangerous. The encounters get more dangerous. Everything kind of ramps up. And there's that tension of, do we press on or do we backtrack? And that you can't really do in a dungeon crawl or a board crawl. So I try to use each of those crawls to, I don't know, satisfy a different need.
I like the idea. Like, I feel like Moria could be really well run with a depth crawl where you're like, you know what? Or like any kind of large underground cavern where you're like, you don't need to map it. Like, it's not relevant how you got here. It's relevant how deep you are, you know, or how long you've been here. Right.
Yeah. And for Wonderland, specifically like a hedge maze is perfect for a depth crawl because at like a high level, looking at a board or like a tabletop map of a hedge maze kind of takes away the feeling of being in a hedge maze where you're like, oh,
absolutely,
do I turn left or right? Like that, I don't know, think of The Shining. Like you can see it, but when you're in it, it feels very different. And rolling
I was thinking
dice,
even more so than The Shining is what's the Harry Potter with the maze?
Oh yes, yeah, where it always like shifts and changes.
Yeah, because the thing that you don't get in The Shining is the like extra dimensional element that you could get with a depth crawl, where it's like it gets weirder and weirder the longer you're in there.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good reason why I brought the depth crawl back to Wonderland, was specifically the hedge maze. And then there are other areas that function that way too.
Great. Yeah. I love that a lot. Yeah. Stygian Library just did like a second edition, and I backed, I mean, not just, it was a couple months ago, but I backed that, and I got Gardens of Yin in that. And those guys like came up with that concept, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And Stygian, the Gardens of Yin, I think feels or has very much the same spirit as what Wonderland. Like I can see that Wonderland was a clear influence into that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
For just like the same sorts of encounters or the same kind of vibe.
I haven't done a cover to cover, but is the Jabberwocky in this?
It is. Yeah.
I thought so. I didn't. Is it in the bestiary?
Yeah.
Because just thinking about the Jabberwocky and that concept in Lewis Carroll, where it like he writes, if you haven't read the Jabberwocky part, it starts totally normal, and he starts adding more and more weird words that you kind of just glaze over, but by the end it's like nonsense. Like, can you talk about did you work that idea into the adventure besides with the Jabberwocky?
Yeah, I think this book is probably the one that has the most surprises or fun just to read. I don't know how to put it any other way other than like, I think a lot of the stuff can't translate at the table, like the sorts of puns or wordplay, or I don't know. I really tried to give a lot of the characters attacks that all kind of like lend themselves together. Or actually, here's a good example is there's a creature with a single eye and a bunch of eye stalks, and each of those eye stalks can do a bunch of different attacks. And those attacks,
like this is like not a beholder.
Yes, absolutely not. I would never refer to it as such. Yeah. But so all those attacks, each one is alphabetical. We're in the spoiler space. We're deep into it now. It's called a shut eye because all it wants to do is get some sleep. So its attacks are anti-gravity, bind limbs, charm, disintegrate, electrocute, flush to stone, guard, and heal. So nothing that's necessarily surprising, but I think, after the second, third, maybe 20th read through of that stat block, you're like, oh, I see what they did. And like, you can't communicate that to your players, right? Like that's just for the reader. But as much of that I tried to instill in the spirit of Lewis Carroll and kind of just, I'm not going to say that this is poetry, but although there are lots of poems in the book as well, there is very much like an element of like, how can I make this fun to read as well as to play?
I mean, I just feel like this book had to be so much fun to make.
It was, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, just because there, and also there's so much license to do whatever you want. I mean, I feel like if I made this book, I would be very worried about leaving what's written. Like, how do you decide when you're going to add things? Like, do you just not even worry about it at all? Or do you try to like have some literary backup for adding monster features? Or like when you make new monsters, where do they come from? Like, I can't imagine there are jelly cubes in,
right. Right. And those come from what feels right. And what do you expect? Like, I think my driving force is like, okay, what is the main theme of the book? So for me, it's combat. So I need to have X number of characters or monsters that are like going to be good combatants. Like I think Wonderland really lends itself to characters that are like NPCs, but I still very much want creatures or characters that you can fight. And then also trying to kind of keep in mind the spirit of like, what do I think of when I think of Wonderland? I think of food, I think of hats, I think of games. And so all of those things are also kind of trying to drive my decisions of like the jelly cube. There's also custards. Like I try to think of like, okay, if there's a kitchen, what sort of encounters or what sort of adventures do I want? Like if we have cooks as an NPC or as a character, then what are they going to be dealing with and what's fun about them? So if they're having feasts, then maybe some of the food has gone bad. And what does that mean? And then it kind of all lends itself to that. So there is an internal logic to how I make a lot of the decisions, like regarding locations and creatures and characters to include. But those decisions are based on like, what is the spirit of the thing? Like I really try to hold the original works with kind of like a not honor, but like definitely with a reverence that hopefully feels like, oh yes, they love the work. And it shows in this kind of like new stuff.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I would have thought you would have said, but it's still always surprising to see the new things where you're like, oh yeah, this fits, but Wait, did I miss that in the book? No, that's new. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so a big spoiler I will get into is, so one of the things I wanted was, how do you interact with Alice? Like, how do you get Alice into this book without it feeling like there's a child in danger, right? Like, I think that's a hard one.
Or like an NPC that's more important than the NPCs, or an NPC that's more important than the PCs.
Yes, yeah, good point. You don't want it to feel like, oh, we're in their story. Or if you do, you still want to feel like you have some agency in that story.
Yeah.
So my solution to that was, and this also like gets into like the bigger picture of like, what is the concept of Wonderland? So to talk about changes that I made, again, to drive kind of like, how do I justify some of these things? Why there's this kind of like unconventional internal logic is because this is kind of like a demi-plane of dreams, which feeds back into some of the original text, but also then kind of justifies why rooms change around and why you might kill an NPC and they're back again. Like, all that stuff makes sense. And so because of that, then Alice kind of takes on the role of almost like the antibody, or like the antibiotics, or like the immune system of this demi-plane. So it's kind of like this unstoppable force that if you're in the space and you're not from Wonderland, then Alice is the one who, it's an automated Alice, like a little automaton. Think like porcelain doll with mechanical joints and that. So
horrifying.
That's the thing. Yeah, but that's also the part of it, right? Like it's so, and okay, this is where I just like get excited about these ideas, which I don't even feel like I take credit for. It's just kind of like, I'm just the conduit for these ideas. But Alice is like the immune system. So you see her or you hear her first, and then you interact with her, and then you're fleeing. So you're like, she's ever present, but also this thing that you're not really trying to interact with. If you think of like, I forget which Resident Evil it is, but there's I think it's called like Big Man or something. It's like a big guy with like a big like trench coat and hat, and they're like unstoppable. Like you can't actually fight them. You just have to run. And that's an element that I wanted in this adventure, because it also kind of like feels like it lends itself to dungeon crawls of fleeing, and then, oh, we can only stay in here so long because eventually Alice is going to find us. And what does that mean?
For me, I'm thinking Inception. Like this is Inception all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
this is like the psyche becoming aware that you're intruding it. So like meta wise, are we like in Alice's dreams? Is that what's going on?
So, and this is where I also try to leave it up to the GM, and every Wonderland can be unique. The source of this kind of like demi-plane is called, I call it the sleeping, but the identity of the sleeping is up to the GM. So it could be Alice, it could be another creature. Like if you wanted to tie this into another campaign, maybe it's a powerful NPC or wizard that you have in your world.
Yeah.
Like it could lie into that. And then what happens when you wake up the sleeping? Does the demi-plane crash and start to unfold? Do you have to kind of like do an End of Zelda run where you're trying to leave the dungeon before all these blocks of the world crash? Like it hopefully feels, I designed this with the idea of like, how do we make this a satisfying conclusion to the game? So you open up those kind of like that 4-poster bed, and what is behind those curtains? And then what do you do with that? Is it a sleeping child? Is it the NPCs? Or are you yourselves kind of like going back into your own dreams? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Zelda because, last time we talked about Breath of the Wild a lot. Clearly, I can see Zelda in your work. But that makes me think like it'd be really cool to see an Andrew Kolb Zelda book, which probably won't ever happen because we'd have to license it from Nintendo. Yeah, but then I go like, when are we going to get to Andrew Kolb like original concept setting?
Like
book?
completely.
Like, have you thought about that? Is that like on the tip? Because I feel like you've done the work to educate yourself on making these things. Like, why not just make your own homebrew, you know?
I think it's tricky because it feels like, oh, I can do anything then. Like, I think I think what I really like about these public domain settings is it gives me an anchor or like a guiding light of like, this is what I want to do. Like, if I can ask and turn it around, like,
sure. With
Pirate Borg, was that, what do I want to ask? Like, is that going to always be kind of your guiding light? Like, do you feel like, what are your anchors? That's what I want to ask. Like when you're creating.
Oh yeah. I mean, for me, Pirate Borg is in the dark Caribbean, which it's Earth, just not ours.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm with you. Like you get all of those anchors to reality. Like I have so many anchors in real history that are so great to pull from. Like all of my top NPCs were all real pirates, But then I also give myself the license to drift away and add in new NPCs or add in new factions that didn't exist. Like there's a faction called the Wretched, which is Lovecraftian style cultists.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
And then of course we're gonna have in this setting book we'll have Atlanteans and Mesoans, which are like Mesoamericans, kind of like a Wakanda. We fought the undead and live in our own little city-state vibe,
Cool.
So yeah, I do that, but I definitely would think when you go to do your own, like let's consider Dark Caribbean is not my own, like Neverland is not your own,
Okay.
like when you do your own, it's like, well, all the doors are open. It's like look at the blank, like the worst thing for a writer is a blank page, right? It's like, well, if are you making a fantasy setting? Like, how do you make it original? That's really hard when you're trying to make a published book. Like, well, you can't just make Zelda. You can't just make Lord of the Rings. Like that has been done. So I don't know. There's some navigation there that you have to do as a creator, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess like to the, like, would you want to branch off from, or like, do you see yourself moving away from the Dark Caribbean to explore other things that either you can't or it doesn't feel like the right fit for?
Yeah.
I mean, I think
for me, it's still a long way out in my mind because, I keep on pushing that project and making it bigger and better.
Yeah.
But I definitely am like, right, as of today, I'm not like, when that book ships, I'm not going to make another pirate setting thing, or if I do, it's going to be like I said with the Wonderland stuff. Like, I want to be able to like not be so bound by logic or like not be bound by history or, like make things fantastic. It'd be nice to like, when you've been in a setting for so long, to like break all the rules that maybe it's not on the ocean at all, maybe it's in the mountains. I don't know. So
when you're approaching a new project, what comes first? Like, do you feel is the box being checked? Like, oh, I want to do something with Lovecraft, and then going, what inherent logic is there to fitting that into this setting? Or do you say, what parts of this setting haven't been explored yet, and then finding it that way? I don't know if it's like an out-in or an in-out, but like, how do you generally
I wouldn't quite say it's chicken or the egg. Like for Lemethron, like all of our things are connected, like I made Pirate Borg after having made a bunch of battle maps and working on the Dark Caribbean. And now I'm working on the Dark Caribbean because that's the thing I've always been working on, like it's much different than like you or some other creators that are making that going from project to project. So like the on-ramp for me, like the default is we're in the Dark Caribbean, it's right. Like so far there's never been a like, I'm going to make something for a different setting. Like I have published nothing that's in a different setting so far, except for some stuff that was like piratey pre-Dark Caribbean, that was like didn't have some of the core rules, but even those still use like historic pirates. So I guess for me as a creator, I'm more like, what do we need? What haven't we done yet? Like I want it to be interesting, but I don't want to like, you don't want to be like reinventing the wheel. You don't want to be like, oh, it's another ghost ship. Like how many of those do we have? That's kind of one of those.
Well, so like Davy Jones' Locker, I don't know if I'm like from like the recent Kickstarter, did that come from, what do we do when there's player death? Or was it, we have Davy Jones, we have like, what can we do with that concept, and then kind of going back to like which way?
I think that one actually came from, there's a Morkborg adventure called Graves Left Wanting by Carl Druid. Carl Druid is the guy who wrote Frontier Scum, which is kind of like a cowboy version, like a Weird West cowboy version of Morkborg. And in that, you like post TPK, you all wake up in the graveyard and you're like, you're not actually dead, but you have not escaped the graveyard. And I was like, you know what? That would be really cool if you woke up in Davy Jones's locker,
Yeah.
And then, just different influences. Like if you've ever played Sea of Thieves, when you die, you go to this boat that's like the ferry of the damned. It's like, imagine a whole world there where you have to get out. So it's a little bit of both, and like, it's hard to say where the genesis is, but you just keep dumping things on the fire, and eventually it becomes a thing. I guess that's my approach. I mean, this is kind of what I was saying earlier. Like I can't make something that I'm not excited about, like I don't think that's in the realm of my, possibilities. Every time I've done a commission, even if it's like for my patrons, like, hey, can you make this ship? And I'm like, this ship that they want is not in the Dark Caribbean. I'm like immediately uninspired to work on it, so that's why I say when you have to be inspired for it. I'm excited to see what you end up finding next, because I can only imagine it'll be something you're excited about, but that you don't know right now. You know, it's coming, but you haven't found it yet.
Yeah. And I think that'll also come with putting in the work too of like not knowing. And that's not articulated well, but essentially what I'm trying to say is just by kind of poking around, like going, oh, do I want to do this? And then going, oh, this is why I don't want to do this. And then learning kind of from those mistakes and then kind of finding the path back from almost like intentionally finding the dead ends. So I can go, oh, this is logically why I'm pursuing this or why this makes the most sense.
Yeah, I have one like that right now. Like I'm kind of kicking around this idea of something after the Dark Caribbean that would be like a game where you're playing as a necromancer or a lich or a,
cool.
death knight.
Yep.
And I do this thing where I'm like, I think that'd be really cool. But then I'm like, what is the game about? Like, what do you do besides kill people and like harvest their, I'm like, what role playing is a like 19th level lich gonna, I'm at a dead end there. And I think it's the kind of same thing where you're poking around to find the thing. And like, there are elements about that I like, but I don't know. I haven't quite solidified it yet.
Right. Yeah. Cause I never think that sort of stuff is wasted energy because
no, absolutely not.
And so early on after Neverland, one of the things I was toying around was like an all bard based setting, like basically like kind of like a band, like you're kind of a rock band, and a lot of that stuff went into Oz and the like cities and the kind of neighborhoods, and then a lot of the demon stuff from that, and by demon stuff I just mean like research and like Word documents full of nonsense, but like that stuff then like worked its way into Wonderland, like that stuff that like that setting probably will never. Well, I don't want to say never. I don't know if I have intentions of pursuing that setting again, but all that work that I did researching cities and how stuff works went into Oz, and all of this stuff around it went into Wonderland. Like it all kind of, there's nothing wasted with that sort of research. At least I don't think so. Do
you ever think about going back? Like, do you ever think about like writing an adventure book for one of your settings?
I don't even know if I would know how to. I think I don't run adventures, and I don't, and I say that as in like, I don't have settings, or like I have settings, but I don't have an adventure in mind. Like I really like drop them in, say, here's what's going on, and then they go. So I don't even know if I would know how to write or design a specific adventure. Maybe there are smaller settings that I could design within these worlds, but I haven't really thought about that specifically. I feel like I've put so much into them that I want to kind of like leave them. Like I don't even know if there's like a director's cut of like stuff that I omitted that I want to get back in. Like,
I know what you're saying. I can definitely see what you're saying with that. Like for me with the Dark Caribbean, it's kind of like that where I'm like, people will ask about like, oh, is the earthquake in Port Royal going to be there? Cause it's like a real thing that happened. I'm like, oh yeah, it's in there. And then I'm like, man, we could write a whole book about what happened there, or a whole book in this other place. But then I'm like, well, it's going to be on that one book already. Like, I don't need to go back there. I gave you the blueprint, you do it,
Yeah. And I really try not to be too prescriptive with my writing of like, oh, if this, then that, or these are the sequences of events, because anytime I've run an adventure with that, it never works out that way.
No, they break it immediately. They immediately smash it. Yeah.
Yeah. My books are always written with the idea of mind of like, what are players going to try to break with us? And even with that, they still break it. So like at the end of the day, I don't know why I would set myself up for that sort of, not failure, but challenge. It's just like not the problem I want to solve.
Or like, I guess not wasted. I mean, it's still helpful, like to have guidelines. Like that's one of the things I got from Mothership is that we do these, what happens if your players do nothing, to kind of like give your, in a port or in the whole setting, what happens if your players don't do anything? These things unfold. But yeah, I mean, as soon as you start, like, what if they change something really big in the first session?
Right.
Then that whole timeline is useless. Like I can see both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, like I definitely try to write my NPCs with goals and kind of like clear, this is what we're trying to accomplish. So that way they are continuing to move, whether the players are doing things or not. Like what you're talking about, like with downtime, like if they're just standing still, the world doesn't just stand still. These are the paths that these characters are moving on.
Yeah.
But not so rigid. Like this is how they get to that goal, because I think that's where the players come in and start to mess up plans. So it's more about, I don't know. I try to design my NPCs to be both proactive and reactive. And I think if I get too structured with their plans, then they're not reactive. Then they're just like, oh, but this is the thing I'm supposed to do next. So I don't know how to work outside of that. Like, oh, if you crumble my tower, then I guess I can't do the thing I'm going to do. And it's like, well, no, I guess I'm going to go build another tower or take over something else over here. Like it feels organic. And I think that's what the players want to see. Like the best reactions I've gotten out of my playtesters have been like, oh no, we did this. Like it's directly a response to our actions. So
what have we done?
Yeah. Like we are digging this hole and we're going to try to, well, we've got a bunch of shovels. So let's try to dig our way out of it. Like I think that's more the sort of adventure I want. And that comes from just a setting.
So are you still running everything with 5e?
Yeah. And I mean, I use that very loosely.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think we can tell that by the way the book is written with the stats and whatnot. Have you checked out 2024 yet?
No. And my players haven't really kind of shown any not desire. I think like haven't really requested it. I think I've changed so much under the hood that I don't even know if I still feel like I'm running the when did it come out?
2014.
2014. Like I don't even know if I really can count it still as 2014.
Well, I mean, I think it seems like from your influences too, that you've definitely kind of moved to the more kind of OSR approach of like, you know what, this is our table and we're going to play what makes sense for this table.
Yeah. And I mean, my players came on board knowing what D&D was. I think this is, what a lot of people run into. They know D&D as a concept. Is it necessarily the best fit for what they actually want to play? Maybe, maybe not. But I feel like it's partially my role to work within those parameters, but maybe also change things that they don't realize needed changing to suit kind of what we want out of the game. Yeah. So I mentioned OSE in the back of Wonderland because I hope GMs who maybe only know 5e will be able to find that and explore it as an alternative.
I mean, yeah, I think I told you before, you're the reason I found the OSR. Like I got Hot Springs Island because of Neverland, and then my entire career changed. So it's your fault.
I mean, that is all I could hope for. That is all I want is to help folks branch out and find other styles of play.
The one thing I really wanted to ask, and I almost asked it at the beginning of the episode, but I decided to wait, is do you have Into the Odd?
I have a PDF of it. Yeah, like I bought it years ago now, and I don't think I've cracked it open now that I think of it.
Do you have the original or the remastered?
No, the original.
Look, I will send you a copy of Into the Odd after we get off this episode, okay? This is a book that is the remastered edition. Johan from Morkborg
That's
fame,
right.
He redid the art, but he did the art and layout. But it is exactly the style of Wonderland's. Like, here, let me show you the cover here.
Right. Also, kind of like a photo bashing, like collage. Yes, that's right. Okay.
And that being said, I think given the kind of weird approach and time setting that this game is in, is exactly the same as like, it could totally be like a late 1700s, early 1800s vibe if you wanted.
Right.
Like, and the rule system is like I would say, like, if you're going to run Neverland, check out Pyreborg. But if you're going to run Wonderland, I think it's got to be, if you're not going to use the prescribed 5e, definitely check out Into the Odd.
Right. Into the Odd. And I think the other is like Bastionland, right? Those are the two.
Bastionland. I mean, yeah, same guy, Chris McDowell. I mean, yeah, they both would work.
Because like with the failed careers and the kits, right? Like as I think a lot of like fun problem solving can be had out of like, oh, all I have is a kettle and exactly 8 feet of rope or
and they're both, I mean, Electric Bastion is the same thing. It's like basically it's like magic infused early 1800s, which is like perfect for this, right?
Right.
I was curious if I'd love to see somebody, if anybody's listening and they run this setting book when it comes out with either, we want to hear about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear about any non-5e game run in any of my settings. There's one that was running Blades in the Dark in Oz because of the whole like...
Oh yeah, that's for the heist stuff?
Yes, yeah. And that was my dream. Like that was absolutely part of the kind of like vision of like, what sort of adventures do you want to have in Oz? And that was absolutely one. Like, okay, let's set up this heist from this rich house and their magic guards and then mundane guards. Yeah, all of it. That's all I could hope for.
Yeah, so when we did the session 1 or session 0 for Pyreborg Neverland, the Aaron's running, I rolled up, I used the core book, but I was like, I'm not going to be like Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm a Lost Boy. I'm a Lost Boy pirate. I was like, I had a bag of marbles, and it was perfect. It was like, it's so cool to mash systems together like that. You get weird results sometimes, but
yeah. And you mentioned the bestiary too. Like my approach with these is to hopefully be as flexible to other systems as possible. It's still, I think, pretty clear if you're running 5e that you know what to do with it. But I also think hopefully if you're running OSC, you can do a bit of translating and it should work.
The hit die stat alone is really all you need in most games to know, like, okay, how powerful is this?
Right.
Yeah. And then come up with it. I just like the approach too of the, like, use what makes sense for I don't need to tell you that the smart creature gets a high bonus on intelligence saves. Right. You are smart enough to know that. The big slow creature is slow at deck saves. Like, I like that kind of design. At first it hurts, and you're coming from 5e, you're used to this like tight system, you know?
Right.
But then you're like, oh wait, no, this is a game. We can make the world in the way we want. Right?
Yeah, I know what I'm doing here. Like, and you realize, oh, I've like, yeah, I think the whole like Karate Kid, like, oh, I've been doing this the whole time, and now I'm putting it into practice, and I can actually do this. Yeah.
Actually, I did want to ask: are you a big fan of The Matrix?
Yes, I think I think I have a new appreciation for it as an adult. I think it was like too cool for me when I was younger, if that makes sense. Yeah. Like I was like, oh, I'm not hip enough to be a part of any of this.
I just thought with the whole, it's just interesting because the White Rabbit tie-in,
right?
Follow the White Rabbit is very Alice in Wonderland, but then also this kind of like, don't think you are, know you are. That's the same thing that we're talking about with the GMs. Yeah. Like if you know you're the one, the GM that can change the rules of the world, then you are. You know? Well, I guess on that tip, can we talk a little bit about the influences? Because obviously, if this is anything like your past books, the literature is the thing that inspires it. Does that apply here? Or are you a fan of the Disney movie? Are you a fan of the Tim Burton version of Alice in Wonderland? Like where do you draw from?
Yeah, I've always loved Wonderland, or like I've always loved the original books. Found some of the poems later, but always have loved Carol's work. So those were always the kind of like anchor for me. And same with the other books, like as much as there are other interpretations, it's still, and those influence for sure, it still goes back to what's the original source material. And I think maybe Oz is where you would see the most deviation. Like I think folks who know the Oz movies have a different sense of the source material. Like I think those branch the most is maybe what I'm trying to get at. With Wonderland, obviously you have the movie, which I think does a good job of kind of pulling some of those kind of core elements.
Do you mean the
animated Disney movie? I think I have a real, I didn't realize this, but I have like a real specific taste when it comes to reinterpretations of, or riffs on Wonderland. I think a lot tend to go grimdark or like just moody and more mature. And that doesn't resonate with me. Like I see it and I respect it. And I think this Wonderland, you could absolutely do that if you wanted. But for me, the original books were always light and fun. And like there's an edge to it, but never really like I felt like a true, like any real danger. So I have a number of other like unofficial sequels that I've read that I adore. And those tend to be the ones that mimic the kind of like gonzo, like surreal approach. So that is my biggest influence. And that's where my approach in this book works. And because I think there are other approaches to Wonderland in the like TTRPG space. And they tend to go darker, and that's
I mean, especially because it's an RPG, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I want there to be danger, but I also want it to kind of be like, oh, what is happening? Like, how did we get into this fight? Or I wasn't expecting this. I don't know, this rabbit to do this sort of damage, or like to affect me in this way, right? Like, so that's also a fun surprise.
Yeah. That makes me think. Like, have you ever considered going for like an IP? I feel like you have maybe the clout now to go for one of those, especially one of the older ones that's like 20 years from being in the public domain, you know?
I don't know. Because I think the one that I definitely would love to do, like if anyone was asking, like, what's your list? I think there is a Discworld RPG.
It's on Kickstarter right now.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Yes. And I think that would be what if anyone said, like, what IP is coming to you, or like what company is coming to you and asking you to do a project, what would be an immediate yes? That would have been it. So that's a moot point now.
Yeah, it's got 9 days left and it's about to break $2 million.
Cool. Okay, well, right idea. I think it was a viable market.
I mean, and I think that would be, you wouldn't have nailed that too. There's so many places that you can go. so many different little vibes that you can do, you know?
Yeah. And I'm sure they're going to do a great job and have a much bigger team and much more qualified team. But
I don't know that those things are necessarily like,
no, but I will say, I think they probably have both. Not a guarantee, but I think those two are both. And I think they're in good hands.
Cause I mean, for me, I was thinking like, well, what could Andrew really knock out of the park? And the one that popped in my mind was Redwall.
Oh, okay.
Like,
yeah.
I feel like something in that, like, kind of, because you're so good at doing the like more like open world but lighthearted, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like what do they call those? Anamorphic mice and rats and snakes. Like that could have been one.
Yeah, and I'm thinking now. I think another setting would be if you've ever seen Over the Garden Wall, the animated like miniseries.
I haven't, but I will. I'm going to add it to my list.
It's also, I mean, as we're recording this, it's very close to Halloween. It's like a very good autumnal watch that has this sort of, I think I gravitate towards fairy tales because there's an internal logic, but it also feels heightened. And I love that balance of there's a reality to it, but like some animals can talk and some can't. Like like this sort of stuff that I think in gameplay, if you really start to pull the threads, it unravels. But if you don't, it's still a good time. And I think that series has a lot of that. Same with like, I don't know. I think Adventure Time would be fun too. Although I think there was maybe also a setting for that too. I don't know. I'm open, but I haven't really thought about specific IPs because it feels.
But there's not like one that you're not like I know number 4. You know, it's not in the public domain yet.
No, I think that would have been. I think that would have been Discworld. I think I love that setting and I love Pratchett's work.
Okay, I have a few questions from Aaron specifically.
Oh, great! I really appreciate Aaron really jumping in with.
I think you have to understand that Aaron. I know she's listening. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
Aaron is a great player, and Aaron is a newer DM.
Cool.
And I think that playing your setting has really opened her eyes to how you can run a game. So. What is the most challenging part of writing these types of campaign books?
Oh, good question. I think it is high level. It's killing your darlings. Like I think it really is going, oh, this was such a great idea, but it doesn't fit anymore. Specifically, it is finding the spine or the kind of core that the book will be built off of. Like, because I think for all of these books, early stages, well, Neverland was a bit different. It was kind of developed independently. But with Oz and Wonderland, it was, okay, I've done all this research. I have all these ideas, but what is the thing that makes all of these disparate ideas kind of come together? And maybe some I will lose along the way, but what is the thing that will bind it all together logically? So with Oz, it needs to be one place. It's not all these like regions in this big world. It is a mega city. And that makes sense for the urban. Like it does all these things that I needed to do. But for that, I really remember, and once it happens, it makes so much sense, but I don't know I'm there until I have that feeling of like, oh, of course, this is what needs to happen. With Wonderland, it was figuring out the map because I wanted dungeon crawl and because I wanted there to be moving parts and for things to change. And I talk a bit about this in the back of the book too. I had the idea that, the entire map would fit onto an 8x8 grid, like onto a chessboard, and each square would be a different region. So you'd have 64 regions, but it felt too big and it felt too samey. And then once I realized that I should make it kind of like these Tetris blocks that we were talking about earlier, and I could interlock them and have things repeat. And it just like, it was that thing where once that like little rip opened up, then all this stuff started spilling out like, I can do this. And then this happens, but I don't know where to kind of poke to get that opening. Or I will explore, and I don't know if it's working until I kind of get that feeling. But that's the hardest part, is finding that kind of catalyst that then makes everything else flow.
So like from a process viewpoint, let's say you start book number 4. At what point in this discovery, writing, sketching process are you going to move into like layout? Like, do you start there, or you get pretty far along before you even put anything into a computer? Because I know you have a lot of hand-drawn stuff.
Yeah. So I would say a lot of my stuff is on the computer early on in just like Word documents and spreadsheets. Like I need kind of like, I need some structure beyond kind of like the blank page. The blank page is usually when I'm writing early notes or just like really granular, singular ideas, like as I'm going to bed, or, I've made lunch and then I have a random idea, so I write it down. I get to design definitely after that kind of point of like kind of Zen state, flow state that we talked about. Like I don't get into the design until I know, oh, this is what I need to do, because then I know the challenges. Then I know what problems I'm specifically solving. Yeah, that's kind of it. Like, and then a lot of it kind of gets fleshed out in that design stage. Like a lot of the tables are admittedly because I know I have this much room. So I have room for 4 tables. What are the 4 tables going to be? And if I only need 3, then I make one table twice as long. Like it then starts to become chicken and egg of like kind of back and forth between the concepts being driven by the design and the design being driven by the concepts. Because I get to do everything, then I get to do everything. So like sometimes the illustrations inform the stat blocks. Sometimes the stat blocks inform the illustrations.
I know this.
Yeah.
One thing I found really interesting too, when you look back at Neverland, like, oh, okay, you kind of came up with a format for a hex, and then you copy it 25 times, and then you populate it. And I'm like, okay, I can get my head around this as a creator, you know. But when I look at Oz, I'm like, oh, dude, this is a whole nother. This is like you exponentially upped the level of pre-design, like the amount of work you had to do to plan it, like the way that you have the subway kind of style chart where they're all connected and I have to imagine that process doesn't just like show up on the page. There has to be a lot of work that goes into like figuring out how you're going to design it and how you're actually going to get it into the program and how you're going to like copy it and make it the same, but also different for each, you know, section of the city, you know? Yeah.
And I include a bit of that in the back of Wonderland, kind of showing the iterations of the spread for each,
with the chessboards and
because it really is trial and error and going, so it's tricky because like with Wonderland and Oz, I'd already kind of like developed the template after Neverland. So I knew kind of loosely, this is kind of the general format, but then it's a question of like, okay, what goes here? Like, I know that there's going to be an image here, but like in the case of Wonderland, it's not like I have a part of the map to show because I have a bigger map over on the right page. So what goes on the left? And then figuring out, well, then I'll just do the high level, like level 3 of the library, level 2 of the library, level 1, like just like a simple, I can reference it and get a sense of what I'm loosely looking at.
Yeah.
But that only comes from trial and error on the literal page and going, do I put a mini version of the map? Do I do this? And going, no, that's not right.
Dude, you're speaking my language, man. I feel like there's probably not, we could fill a small hotel conference room with all the people on the planet who make a living doing what you and I are talking about right now.
Yeah.
Where we have to fight our writer and artist ourselves to make them all work in layout. You know, it's not a huge group. It's definitely,
it's every stage because it's from the map. It's from the
every
character illustrations. All of it is going, okay, well, if I change this, then I have to reorganize alphabetically all of the monsters. So I'm just going to come up with a different name. So that way it goes there. Yeah.
The worst is a late stage big design change where you're like, oh my God, this is going to ripple back through everything, you know?
Yeah. And that's where I really try to find a solution that minimizes that change and going, okay, instead of, so maybe an example of this is the blocks. I had given them arbitrary numbers like on each level. So like 101, 102, 103. And then at some point I realized if the location is going to change, none of these numbers actually make sense. It needs to be alphabetical, but I still wanted the first block to be the block that you always kind of enter in if you're going the natural way into Wonderland. Yeah. So I needed to come up with a title. It was originally called The Rabbit Hole, but alphabetically that's not going to be first. So then I was like, okay, I can't just move this around. Like I have to come up with something. So I named it Arrival.
I know.
So that way it's the first alphabetically. Like, and it makes sense. Like it's also like I have to justify this, but it also still works. And then I don't have to rearrange everything. I don't have to come up with a different solution. It's alphabetical and it's also still number 1. So I'm happy with that and I move on. But that only comes from trial and error and going, this is a problem I need to solve and I need to solve it now.
Okay. I have a super nerdy one. Why are the tables in this one, why do they have rounded corners?
Oh, I appreciate you noticing that. And it's because...
Oh, I noticed immediately.
Because playing cards have rounded corners.
Perfect. I'm so glad I asked.
And I don't think that would ever... Only because you have background in design and your own experience.
But Oz and Neverland have the exact same table style.
Right.
Pretty much, right? I mean, you add way more colors in Oz because it's much more color coded, but...
Yeah. No, rounded corners because playing cards are rounded corners. I'm so glad you asked that.
If this was the Daily Show, that would be the moment of Zen. Is that right there?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Aaron's final question was, what is the most important thing you learned while writing these 3 books?
Oh, I would say it's to kill your darlings. Like it's that it's okay if you have something that you love and it doesn't fit anymore. You have to be okay with letting it go, not forgetting it. I think that's different. I think letting it go for this project. And we were talking about earlier, like I think a lot of the stuff that I let go either shows up somewhere else or hasn't yet been used, but is still worthwhile because it informs something else. There are lots of ideas in all of these books that I would love to include, but it didn't make sense. And then it just felt like I was shoehorning in something because I wanted to include it. But I think the books are better for it because it is, at least in my mind, like really still kind of like with a specific vision. So yeah, be okay to let go of something that you think is a really great idea because I think you will come up with more.
Yeah, for me, the Kill Your Darlings things comes in with illustrations.
Oh yeah, okay.
I'm a newer illustrator. I haven't been illustrating that long, and it's sometimes it'll be like, man, I spent so long drawing this. I gotta get it in the book. Like, nope, you don't. Like sometimes you had to just draw that to, the one thing I've been saying to myself and my friends a lot lately is like, every step you take is a step in the right direction.
Oh, great.
It's like the very like Zen thing. Like wherever you go, there you are. Like, yeah, maybe that thing you spent all day writing or designing or playtesting, like, isn't that great? Or maybe it just doesn't fit, like you got to know when to cut those things, man. Yeah. You got to kill your darlings.
Well, my suggestion is do what I do and include like a little kind of like, I don't know, sketchbook in the back where you can include all of your canceled or like next illustrations.
I do really appreciate that. I find that would be very hard for me to include. I'm not saying no. The thing that makes me want to do it is how much I appreciate seeing yours.
Oh,
but for me, I'm always like, I'm not going to show up the stuff that wasn't good enough.
Oh, but see, and my whole thinking was, I love seeing that in other people's projects. They might,
that's fair.
They might like to see it in mine. I'm sure that, and I would love to see it. Like I love seeing people's processes. Even
the
just
flowcharts alone, dude. The flowcharts are so cool. Like seeing all the way, like I'm looking at them right now. I'll think about it. The thing is also, I feel like you have a lot more on paper than I do. Like a lot of my stuff goes into Obsidian, which is just like a note-taking program that's only Markdown. You can't even you can put pictures in there and then it's just like layers. How much time did it take to do these? Like, what do you call these sketchbook sections?
Not very long. I think it's also to benefit now that I know I'm going to include this section. So I'm like, I'm going to
along the way.
I'm going to keep these files, and because I think Neverland probably has the thinnest sketchbook section because I either lost stuff or would erase something when I came up with a bad idea and start over. Now, knowing that I get to put this stuff in, I go, okay, I'm going to accept this mistake and do it again somewhere else so I can show those iterations. Like I think the Alice illustration has, 9, 12 different versions. Like I could not get her face right.
It's almost like an Andy Warhol.
I only did those after I'd finished the first one and said, you know what, I'm not happy with this. I will come back and make this better. And then only after finishing all the other illustrations do I do 15 or 20 more.
It's very interesting because for me, I'm like, any of these, she's terrifying no matter what. These all would have worked.
But it's the hard, what it's like where you have something in your head and it's not communicating it. So why not try to see if you can kind of find that language a bit better?
Do you have a thing lately? I've been struggling, or actually I've been struggling less, but over the years I've had this thing where I'm like always like on the clock, like always running out of time or always trying to get done as quickly as I can. And I just try to take a step back and be like, I have not only a dream job, but a job I didn't dare to dream. I owe it to everybody else in the world to enjoy this process. Do you have that struggle too?
Yes. And I think the timelines are a big part of that. It's often when I see the project completed, like when I'm holding any of these books in hand, I go, man, that's very cool that I got to do this. I'm so lucky that I get to be here. The fact that we're here talking to each other about these problems and challenges is so cool. I don't know if I'm always in it when I'm in it, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know if I'm always kind of aware. It's usually not until the illustration
positively or negatively?
Positively.
That's my problem is sometimes.
I think not that I'm in a negative state, but it's like, I need to solve these problems. That's kind of like my Zen state when I'm drawing or writing is like, I need to fill this table with 12, answers. But I also find that I try to work ahead of schedule so that way I can go back and stuff that I wasn't happy with after a couple days or weeks, I can go, do you know what? This is fine. Like I like this. And then the stuff that I'm still not happy with is the stuff where I go, okay, no, I do actually need to address this, because I will open the book when it's printed and look at it and go, oh, I should have spent more time on that. So
I know.
That's
I
where
have a couple of those in Pirate Borg. I have a couple public domain ones.
Okay.
Like when I started, there was a lot more public domain. And then as I would go through, I'd be like, no, I got to draw my own thing for this. And there are a couple in there where I'm like, man, I wish I had just done the work. You know, I wish I had just, like, every time people stop at the Zealot and they're like, oh, this looks cool. I'm like, well, that's like an etching. It's like one of the only ones. Every time it hurts, you know, it's so I can appreciate that. But also, I have just kind of told myself lately that, like, I want to be able to look back on this piece of art or this book or whatever and think fondly of the time, not of like stress and self-doubt. It's really hard to like separate this two and remember, like, man, what a cool thing that I could just dream up pirates and people like want it.
So what are you doing now in your process to, not to put you on the spot, but what do you think you're doing currently to help with that? Like to try to be more, I don't want to say mindful, but like,
well, like today
aware.
I am making a underground, like a deep underground cavern that has like a Mayan temple in it as a battle map.
Cool.
And today, right before we got on the call, I was doing we call it rendering in the industry, right? Where I was filling in the details of the outlined stalactites, right?
Okay.
And I think previously, you know, a year ago, I'd have been like, get this done as quick as possible. I wanted to look good, but like, and today I was very much like, I want these are my stalactites. Like, I want to live in this cave while I'm drawing these stalactites. So I was like trying to enjoy each stroke and like redo them with grace and not out of spite that I can't get it out of my head the first time. You know? So that's just my one example for the day.
My gut also tells me that you can see that in the finished product too. Like, I think you can tell when someone, like when we were talking about like making something just to make it, I think when you really enjoy something, I think it comes through. I think on a subconscious level, or maybe just like something about the stroke on the page just hits different when you are like moving the stylus or the pencil with like joy. If that doesn't sound too high. You know,
concept. I would like to think that is always true. And in my experience with Pirate Borg and with my Patreon, it has been true. I think the success has been like a slow, gradual, like a slow thing that continues to get brighter and brighter. Whereas I've seen other creators who I know don't have the passion or who have hired a bunch of people and they like smash the thing together and maybe it has a really good marketing push. But like, I think people can tell there's not love behind it, you know?
Yeah.
And I would like to think that projects like yours and mine, like as people get into them, like, oh, they bought it. Like, yeah, you got it in the store. Like for your book, I got it at Barnes and Noble, you know? And I was like, oh, this is cool. It's like, it's 5e, but it's not. And it's like kind of like a storybook, but it's an RPG. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But then like here we are like 4 years later and I'm still talking to you about it. Like that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't put the love into it. Right.
I appreciate that. And I think that resonates. Like, I think there's I don't know. And I also don't want to be too critical of any industry, but I think like any sort of like, I don't know, food prep, I think there is something to be said for spending a bit more time or really kind of putting that labor into the food and then getting something really kind of like satisfying out of it. And part of that is just making it. Like, I think I really get joy out of making these books and the end product I think is also rewarding, but I think that serves a different need than the kind of like fast food approach to kind of creation. I don't know. This now gets into kind of like the high level of like what it is to be an artist in the modern era.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I have any answers to that, but I would prefer, well, I don't know. I say this being able to like pay my bills. I would prefer to make something that only connects with 20 people, but really connects with them than something that everyone likes for 10 minutes and then forgets about forever.
Sure.
And I don't know if I have any control over that.
You have the never ending artist struggle of like, you know, like, do you want to be Taylor Swift's not a good example because I think she does both for a lot of people, but you know, like, do you want to be like a big pop star that we're saying no, but you don't also want to be like living on like welfare and borrowing money from everyone, you know, or like developing unhealthy habits. Like there is a balance of that. Like you have to be somewhat commercially successful in order to continue to do that thing. Like it can't, if it only matters to 20 people, you're probably not going to be buying a house with that money.
Right. And I mean, also logistically, a publisher or let's say a Kickstarter, like has different goals based on what you think the audience for that is. And some of that is dictated by, let's say, marketing or making sure that those people see it. But at the end of the day, I want to put out something that I'm proud of and passionate, like behind. And that's not going to be every project, and that's okay too. I think maybe that's the other thing. And when you're talking about balances, is these books are like the thing that I will put in the extra time because I love them so much. But that's not all of my work. Like there's lots of work that I do that is to pay the bills, and I do what I need to do. And not that I cut corners, but I don't go back and go, oh, I'm not happy with this. I go, it's okay. And it's only going to be out for 12 months or for a blog post, and then that's it. And I kind of accept that and kind of move on, because I don't think you can survive on just one or the other. I think you need to kind of have, like you said, have that balance.
We do live in reality.
Yes. Yeah.
Despite also living in Never Neverland, right?
Yeah. A little bit of escapism. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, it's been a pleasure having you on. I hope you'll come back on when your next book is queued up and ready to go. Listeners, you can find Wonderland and all of Andrew's books, hopefully in your local game store or bookstore. If not, you can get it all over the internet. Andrew, any closing thoughts? Anything you want to plug where people can find your work?
Sure. Yeah. So my website is kolbisneat.com. My last name is spelled Kolb, like Bravo is neat. I don't know. I think that like, it's very clear when you're reading it. Saying it out loud, I'm not very good at. Anyway, if you type in Andrew Kolb or Andrew Kolb Neverland or Oz or Wonderland, I think that stuff will pop up. And I know we said this at the top of the show. Obviously, getting the books at a local game store helps brick and mortar and helps your community. So that's always going to be my recommendation. I appreciate sometimes that's a bit more money. And that's usually because it pays the people who are in your community a bit more. So keep that in mind. But if you can't afford that, then if you're going online, leave a review, good or bad. I don't mind, but
leave a good review.
I appreciate that. Do you know what I will ask for is an honest review. That's all I ask.
Yes, will hopefully be a good review. Right? Yes.
But as long as it's sincere, that's all I want. And if you're going to buy online, then that's what I would suggest is if you want to try to help, then leaving a review always does.
You've been listening to the Ship of the Dead podcast. Email your questions, comments, and buried treasure tips to shipofthedead@limithron.com. You can support the program, join our Discord server, get early access to new episodes, and instantly download hundreds of battle maps, assets, and adventures at limithron.com/Patreon. Tiers start as low as $2 a release, and you only get charged when I make something new. Pirateborg, my rules-light, rum-infested hack of Morkborg, is available now at pirateborg.com and retail stores everywhere. Ship of the Dead is produced by Limithron LLC, our audio editor is Matt Kepler, and our music is by Alexander Miller. For more, head to limithron.com.